being with you all today. I'm really over the ice, and I'm sure it'll probably be gone by tonight or something, but I'm so thankful that there's still a way that we can kind of be together even though it's not in person. And so, welcome. Welcome to Bible study from your home, in your pajamas maybe, I don't know. I hope everybody had a good break with the holidays, and I was thinking over my holiday, and I'm like, it was good, bad, and ugly, and messy all at the same time. And I know that that's probably normal for most people. Like, it's never just good. And if it is, just don't brag about it to me, okay? Because no, I'm just joking. But this over the break, I just really thought through, how my break went. It was different than I expected. I think I had a lot of expectations, like people normally do for the holidays. But I just learned a lot this time around about being thankful for when it's not always good, and what can I be thankful for even if it's hard. And so there were good things in my holidays that I'm thankful for, and I'm sure you all have it too. I think it's good to do that so you don't lose your joy. So we're getting back into Acts, and I hope everyone was able to get the packet. I love that if you got the packet already and you've looked through it, like every part of it's like snow, snow, winter, snow. And I think it's ironic because we didn't know it was going to snow like this when we were putting the pictures in there, but I think we were hoping for it. Now I'm a little over it, but it's beautiful, and we have everything printed and ready. If you haven't picked it up, you can get it on Sunday. If you want to go online and go to the women's page on the website, there's a link to download it if you want. You can print it at home. It's a lot of ink, or even if you want to just look back over the questions and stuff. I highly recommend that. I'm so thankful that's even an option. So, just so you know, I've been praying about, what do we do next year? Because we're coming to the end. By the time we get done with our study this year, we're going to be done with Acts in the spring. And so I just want you to know I'm praying over what that should look like. And if you feel so led to pray, you should pray with me on where we should go next. And I think the Lord will lead, and I'm excited for what it'll be. So I'm kind of anticipating that. This week we're picking up in the middle of Paul's second missionary journey. And by the end of our passage today, he'll end up in Antioch back home. And so before we jump in, I just want to take a second pray. So pray with me. God, I just thank you for your word, and I thank you that we can come to it even if we're not together, and come around it and study it together, Lord. And I just pray for my words this morning, that they would just be what you want them to be, and that you would speak through me the message that you want me to say. Obviously, you have me here, and I thank you for that, God. And I just pray that it would be fruitful, God, that your spirit would work among all the ladies who are listening, and that you would just have your way with us this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I want to take a glance back, just because when I came to the packet this time and I started studying, I was like, where are we? I don't remember. It's embarrassing how much I don't remember from where we left off. So I figured I might not be alone. It might be good to just kind of, since our break was so long, just look back a little bit and just think through where we just came from. So in the fall, we were in Acts 14 through 17, pretty much, which covers Paul finishing his first missionary journey, and it goes into his second. We saw Paul come home with Barnabas, so excited about what the Lord had done after the first journey. And we saw the dispute taking place there about circumcision, and we see them going up to Jerusalem to bring it to the church leaders there. And they come back from Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas do, sharing all the way about what the Lord had done on their journeys. Like, just as they went up to Jerusalem and back down, just anybody they came in contact with, they were sharing about what the Lord was doing. And as they came down from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's on a hill, back to Antioch, they brought Silas and Judas with them. And then we saw later that there was, we don't know how much time, but a dispute that Barnabas and Paul had about bringing John Mark to go back and check on the churches that were just born from their last trip. And Barnabas and Paul split ways, Paul going to check on the churches and taking Silas, and then soon after that, meeting Timothy as he goes and taking him with him on his journey. And then Barnabas going with John Mark. So they split ways, and thus we see Paul with this group of men with him on the second missionary journey. The bulk of what we studied in the fall was that journey, and he visited the churches that were born on the first journey. And then he went farther because the Lord led him to Macedonia. He gets to Philippi, which is really an area now that the Romans have a dominant presence. And in Philippi, Paul and Silas meet Lydia. They help the demon-possessed girl get freed from jail. They lead the jailer to the Lord, and then they get sent away from the city because there's so much conflict in Philippi. Paul and his companions travel then to Thessalonica, and we see Paul enter their Jewish synagogue. This was the place where we saw some Jews accept Jesus, and others who were jealous and created a mob and started a riot in the city. The believers sent Paul and Silas to Berea because of that. And in Berea, we see that the Bereans there received the word eagerly. They're people that had a reputation for searching the scriptures, which I thought was just so unique in all these stories. But soon, because the angry Jews from Thessalonica come down to find Paul in Berea, he's sent away again. This time, Silas and Timothy stay back in Berea because this church is just now born, and they're there to kind of help disciple. And so he's sent alone to Athens. And Athens was the final place Paul landed in our study before we took our break. And there we saw his approach to evangelism. He watched and observed the people, got to know them. He saw how and what they worshiped. And then he met them right where they were on Mars Hill and preached the gospel to them, relating to them in a way that they could understand, respectfully, in a way that they could receive it. And I just think that was such a good example to us on like how to reach people. You know, you get to know them, you make a relationship with them, then you're respectful with them as you share. And some people got saved, and that's where we left off. So let's go ahead and jump right in and read from chapter 18 in Acts, and we'll start in verse 1. It says, "After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, he came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them. And they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks." So here we see Paul enter the city of Corinth. This is a major city in the Roman Empire because it was an important crossroads of trade and travel. This city was really known for its sin, and mainly its sexual sin. And I think, we talked a lot about it when we studied Corinthians this last couple of years in church on Sundays. But yeah, it was really known for sexual sin. It's kind of like Las Vegas on steroids, I think. Like when I think about it, I think there's a lot of bad things with Las Vegas, but it's like worse in a way because the prostitution and the sexual sin that's tied to the idolatry is so bad in Corinth. The commentary in the packet really gave a good historical picture of what it was like. But in essence, it was a big city where people were surrounded by idol worship and sexual sin. Back in this time, people would refer to someone living a loose life. They would call that person a Corinthian. Like a Greek would just say, "Oh, you're like a Corinthian." They're talking smack about you and your bad sexual sin. Like if you're a loose living kind of person, you'd be a Corinthian. So it was definitely had a reputation. So here, Paul is landing in this city alone, and he finds people that share the same God and the same trade, which, I think if you're ever in a place like you start a new job and you're like, you feel all alone, and it's like maybe you're surrounded by a lot of people that are just steeped in the world. When you find that person, it's like-minded, and then if they work with you every day, that's even better. So I'm sure it was like, oh, he was so excited to meet them. So during this time, if a Jewish person was a rabbi, like a man, wanted to be a rabbi, the tradition was for them to also have a trade. So in case, his ministry as a rabbi fails, he has something to fall back onto. So thus we see an example of this in Jesus. He was a rabbi, but he also was a carpenter. That was his trade. And we see this also with Paul. He was a tent maker. I loved when I was looking at the text, I found it so interesting that it refers to, Paul seeking out Aquila and Priscilla in several different ways. It says he found them. Another part it says he came to them. Another part it says he stayed with them. So there's definitely this action of him pursuing these people, this couple. Mainly because they share the same trade, but it mentions here that Aquila and Priscilla came from Italy because they were sent away because the Roman leaders there didn't want the Jews in the city anymore. Our verses imply that they were already Christians, and I tend to agree. I tend to agree with that. Historians say that the conflict that arose in the Roman community stemmed from Pentecost. And so I think this is really interesting. If you all remember, hi Victoria, we have people trickling in just for fun that are here. So historians say, the conflict arose and it stemmed from Pentecost. So this is what it led up to Aquila and Priscilla leaving Rome or Italy. People at Pentecost, if we rewind, got saved. They were Jews from all over the world, right? They got saved from Peter's teaching, and they all went home. And so some people went home to Rome, right? And then they did what Paul did on his missionary journeys, most likely. They went into the synagogues and shared the gospel with their other Jewish people, their friends, And then people got saved in Rome. And thus, that's how the Roman church began, right? And so just like Paul had conflict in the synagogues, these new Christians that got saved at Pentecost have conflict in their synagogue in Rome, right? And the political leaders I really don't think they liked the Jews because they caused so much trouble. They got fed up with it and sent them away. So this is what I understand on how Aquila and Priscilla got sent out of Rome. Most likely because there was conflict with the Jews, all the Jews got sent out. And so that's how they end up here meeting Paul. So I think that's interesting because there was no missionary that went to Rome. Like there was no Paul that went to Rome to share the gospel. It was just believers that got saved that brought it home. And I love that. That's how the gospel spreads. So another note that I think is important here as he's in Corinth is that it's clear from other passages in the Word that he wrote his letter to the Romans in Corinth while he was in this place during this time. And we have it in the form of the book of Romans now. And I believe by him getting to know Aquila and Priscilla and living in such a pagan, sinful, Roman-run city like Corinth, he had a heart for the Roman church. And we see in his letter how he addresses how to live in such a messed up world. That's what Romans is kind of all about. Not only is Paul working, making tents, he, of course, is going to the synagogue and trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. We see that in our text. So let's read what happens next. Picking up in verse 5, it says, "But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solely testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ." Finally, we see Silas and Timothy catch up to Paul in Corinth. They had stayed back in Berea helping that church to get established. And here we see a shift in Paul's work when they arrive. It says, in essence, that he didn't need to continue making tents when they got there. It seems that Silas and Timothy most likely brought a money gift from another church. Most commentaries say it was from the church of Philippi. And so they bring this money, and now he can be supported by another church and not have to make tents in Corinth. And this frees Paul up to devote himself completely to preaching to the Jews in the synagogue. I love this picture of how the church works. God places a desire in people's heart through the Spirit and helps out others that are serving Jesus and God, and he uses them to provide for ministry. That's like how God sets it up and how it works. We see it today. Paul didn't work alone. He valued the idea of working as a team. And you can almost sense it in the passage, like he feels freed up. Not because of the financial burden, but just like he's not alone, like his friends are back and he's doing ministry with them again. I think you can just sense it in the passage. And that's how it is, oftentimes with each other. God often uses us to bless each other and oftentimes has us serving together as a team. It's not supposed to be just a one-man show in our lives, He wants us to be together. And I just find it personally true, just even within women's ministry. So many of you ladies, you come to me and you're like, use me. I want to help, and I love that. I feel like it's kind of unique. I don't think every church is like that, but I feel like that's the way it ought to be. And so I'm really thankful. I found myself, even currently in a season where I have to take a few steps back and just like focus on my home a little bit more. And my ministry stuff I don't have to worry about because it's beautiful. I have women that want to help, that they take on everything so that I don't have to go alone, carry all the burden. And it's such a blessing because it's not a one-woman show. It's not just me doing all the stuff, it never should be. So, I'm just thankful for that. I'm thankful that we can serve together. Let's read verses 6 now. It says, "But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, 'Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles.'" Here we see Paul sharing the whole gospel, and the Jews respond. Their response is to resist Paul's message and to blaspheme him. I got stuck on that word. They said it in different ways in different translations, but the Greek word here means to speak with disapproval, to rail at, to revile, to scold, to utter maliciously false statements, to injure someone's reputation by misrepresenting them. And who did they do this to? They didn't do it to Paul. Like, they did it to Jesus, right? That's who they're blaspheming, right? I think Paul could take it if the resistance was towards himself, but it wasn't, It was resisting, disapproving, and misrepresenting Jesus. And this is where Paul drew the line. He's like, that's it. What he says here is very much a statement that has meaning derived from the Old Testament. If you look throughout the word, in Leviticus 20, we see this phrase, "Your blood be on your own head," multiple times in that chapter. And it's talking about the consequences for sin that deserve death. That's what that term is being used for in Leviticus 20. And we see a similar term in the New Testament in Matthew 27:24-25. It says, when Pilate is judging Jesus and can find nothing wrong with him, yet the crowd's calling out for his death, he washes his hands and makes a statement about how he's innocent of Jesus' blood. John Corson explained this well by pointing out the meaning of the different biblical uses of the phrase. He said, blood on the head means I've brought judgment on myself, right? And the phrase blood on the hands means I've failed to reach out to others. In regards to our passage today, when Paul says, "Your blood be on your own heads, I am clean," John Corson summed it up, I thought, really well, and I'm going to read what he said to clarify. He said, "Because Paul was faithful in sharing the gospel with the Jews at Corinth, their blood would not be upon his hands, because he didn't fail to reach them, but upon their own head if they rejected his message. It'd be their own judgment." People are responsible for what they do and how they respond to hearing the gospel. If they reject it, it's their responsibility. We're not held accountable when it comes time for judgment. But the sobering part of this is our responsibility that is implied here by Paul, right? We do have a responsibility to share the gospel. It makes me think of Romans 10:13-14. It says, "For whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how will they hear without a preacher?" And later down in verse 17 of Romans 10, it says, "So faith comes from hearing, and hearing the word of Christ, by the word of Christ." So how can people around us know what it means to be saved? The method God chooses most of the time is us, right? We're the method in which that is shared. We have a responsibility to share as he leads us. It is what he calls us to do, to go make disciples. I think the key for us is to just be sensitive to his spirit and always be on the watch for opportunities. I'll never forget a time a while back when Janet invited me to go with her to meet with this young woman that we heard was very sick, and she wanted someone from the church to come see her. So Janet invited me, and I was like, this is not I'm not like that kind of person, but it was something she probably did quite a bit in her time as a pastor's wife, But she asked me to go with her, and we didn't know all of her details, but she was open to talk to somebody, so we went. And initially it seemed that, in my mind, from my impression, that we'd be coming weekly, we would be following up with her. So I went in with the mind of let's just get to know her, let's just have a relationship, I don't know if we're going to share the gospel this time, let's just hang out, get to know her. But Janet was led to share the gospel. She was right away. And I was kind of awkward, okay, we just met this girl, is that going to make her kind of nervous? But she was super open to Janet. And so then I started sharing, we both shared, and I can tell it was what the Lord was leading us to do. And she never accepted the Lord during that visit, right? But one thing we could see clearly was that she was probably dying. It became clear, and that she did not know Jesus. And I look back on that time, it was such a lesson to me because I was willing to wait. I had my own plan when I went in. But Janet lived as if it was her last day, And that's always going to stick with me. That's the way to go, I'm so thankful we took the opportunity to share with her because after that meeting, she kept communicating with us, but we never did meet again in person. She just kind of stopped. But I know that she heard the gospel, even if it, maybe that was the only time, I don't know, but at least I know. It was the only opportunity we got with her. So, there's wisdom in living like this, maybe our last day, there's wisdom in living like that. We never know if we'll get another opportunity with people. And I think it's wise to take those opportunities when they present themselves, especially if the Lord obviously is leading you, Paul was an awesome example of this, I think. So after Paul tells the Jews that he's going to go to the Gentiles, let's see what he does next in verse 7 and 8. It says, "Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus," which I think is just an amazing name. Crispus is just fun to say. "The leader of the synagogue believed in the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized." So I think this is hilarious. It's so awesome, too. But Paul's probably in his efforts to make the Jews jealous. He goes and stays next door to the synagogue. It's likely this house was attached to the synagogue. And by Paul going next door, the Jews couldn't help but to see the miracles and watch the church grow right before their eyes. I just think it's hilarious. Then what comes next is so exciting. The leader of the synagogue gets saved, right? Because Paul stuck around next door and was still continuing to preach. And it's not just him and his household that believes, it's many other Corinthians start getting saved and baptized. And so I think you just see this revival. You just see God, the Spirit working. And there's fruit here in Corinth, and the church is being born. It's so exciting. And in the midst of all of this, which is so fascinating, we see in verse 9 the word "and," a connector word that takes us into something else that's happening as well. So at the same time, we have this "and" connecting us in verse 9. It says, "And the Lord said to Paul in the night by vision, 'Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city.'" It almost seems out of place to me when I was reading it to see the Lord tell Paul to not be afraid. It kind of seemed like the last thing that he'd be feeling would be fear by watching, the church growing and seeing the Lord do all these things through him. But here we can see through the verses that Paul was, in fact, afraid. And why would he be afraid? I asked myself that. Why would he be afraid? He's looking around, and he sees the Holy Spirit saving people and working, right? And he's afraid because he knows what this means, because this is a pattern we see in Acts. He knows that when the Lord is at work, the enemy is hot to pursue and bring about trouble. So he's anticipating something bad, like every time the church gets born in any city he goes into, there's always opposition, there's always trouble. Paul knows this from his experience. After all, he's been imprisoned, he's been beaten, stoned, left for dead, and throughout his journey. And he knows that opposition always comes when the gospel is shared, and definitely when it is received. Paul was probably looking around and thinking it was almost time to pack his bags. He might have had his bags packed. I don't know. Because this is the point in his stays in places where people drive him out or try to kill him, And think about the place that he's in right now, a very evil, corrupt city, a big Roman city, a place where he can't probably walk down the street without being approached by prostitutes all along the way. It's an intense place to be, right? It's probably not necessarily a place you wanted to live, you know what I mean? And it's probably scary, and maybe wearisome to know he may be driven out by the Jews at any point. But I love what God says to him. It's not what God has always said to him before, which I find really interesting. It wasn't a promise that God had over all his journeys, but it is reassurance for the circumstance now. Let's look at it again. It says, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." We see God meeting Paul in the midst of his fears. Paul maybe didn't even know that he needed direction. Maybe his bags were already packed. But God's so faithful to meet people where they are, He didn't have to speak to Paul at this point. He didn't have to speak to him at all. But he knew where Paul was in his mind, and he was gracious to slow down and reassure him, Slow Paul down and reassure him. And I feel like God is the same with us. He meets us in our fears when we seek him. He knows when we need leading or redirection. The part that stood out to me the most was he reassured Paul in his calling, to trust him and to not fear. God calls us to different things, and isn't fear the thing the enemy uses to throw us off and make us doubt and trip us up? It always is, I feel like. Fear can leave us ineffective if we don't look to the Lord, and can direct us away from what God wants us doing. That's often what fear does. I was thinking about this week and came to this thought, what is the solution for fear? I was just thinking about that. And amazingly, I just looked back at the verse, and I feel like God gives the solution to fear right here when he says to Paul, "For I am with you." It seems too simple, we do not need to fear because God is always with us, but that's really the solution to our fear, is to remember that he's with us. I find, though, I need that reassurance all the time, I feel like, to be reminded that he's with us. So many times my fear is connected to the things that I can't control, like my kids. In theory, I can have some control, but really, or other people's decisions. I can't control that. And that's normally where my fear sprouts up. But to know that God who created all things is in control and is with me is so reassuring. It reminds me of when my kids are little, or even sometimes now, they have fear, whether it's about what will happen or things that scare them. And sometimes all I need to do is help them calm down and not be afraid, is to be present with them, right? To talk them down, to speak truth about the situation and give them perspective that they couldn't have beyond themselves, right? And so oftentimes it's similar with us and the Lord, right? He gives us the right perspective in our fear. He knows what to say to give us peace. And he takes time to do it. He doesn't just they just need to remember what I told them in the Word, But he slows us down and he reminds us and oftentimes repeats things to us that we need to hear again. God doesn't just reassure Paul that he's with him, but here we see him reassuring Paul that he will not be attacked or harmed while in Corinth. And this really struck me as well. God doesn't always promise us safety. Paul often was attacked and harmed. This is why he feared, right? I believe it is. I liked what John Corson said about this as well. He said, "Sometimes the Lord keeps us from trouble. Other times, however, the Lord is with us in trouble. And he was with Paul in Lystra and Philippi." Sometimes we have, seasons of less opposition when we serve Jesus, and sometimes it's super intense when we serve Jesus, right? But God's always so faithful to meet us either way. He didn't have to tell Paul anything, but he knew Paul needed to hear those things at that exact moment. We can trust him to meet us when we need him the most. Seeking him is always the place to be, because that is where our hearts are available to him. And so I encourage you, if you're feeling like you're not hearing from God, be faithful on your part to seek him. And he's going to be faithful to meet you. That's how he works. May not be the way you want him to meet you, but he will meet you. So what does Paul do with what God spoke to him? He settled for a year and a half in Corinth. Besides Ephesus, this is the one place he stayed longest in his missionary journeys. He took up residency. He stayed and settled. Let's move on to verses 12 through 17. It says, "But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, 'This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law.' But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, 'If it were a matter of wrong or vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters.' And he drove them away from the judgment seat, and they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things." So Luke takes a minute to just pause and say, and this also happened while he was in Corinth, while he was there for his year and a half. Here we see the Jews finally making strides to get rid of and punish Paul. And on this occasion, the proconsul stays out of it. You can hear Gallio's irritation from the Jews, with the Jews. You can tell he doesn't like them. He seems anti-Semitic, he probably was. It's an example of even when we are accused wrongly, when our enemy tries to take us down, God can use even the ungodly to protect us. He does that sometimes. Sadly, we see here that where he judged Paul rightly, he was wrong with the action he took on the new synagogue leader, or just ignoring and having a blind eye to it. In other translations, it says the Greeks took Sosthenes and beat him in front of the proconsul. And this is the new, the one that replaced the guy that got saved, Christius, I think that's the way you say it. But this is the new guy, and he's being beaten. It's just another picture of how corrupt the city is, or was. Moving on to verse 18, it says, "Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow." So finally, Paul takes off, and we see him move towards Syria, which is where Antioch is where his home base is. He's heading back home. But before he sets sail, Luke mentions that Paul stops for a haircut. Why are we talking about a haircut? Because he was keeping a vow, right? And so in our normal life, this doesn't mean much to us. But if you're, a reader of the Old Testament, it might cue up your ears to wait, I feel like this sounds familiar. Haircut, vow. And so it was very much likely that it was the Nazirite vow that we see in the Old Testament. And I don't think you could be dogmatic about what it was for sure, but I love that it's a sign, I feel like, a picture of how Paul did not reject his Jewishness. You know what I mean? He was still a Jew and he was proud of it, even though all the Jews disliked him, or a lot of them did. Just because he was a Christian didn't mean that he just rejected all of his Jewishness. And I think that's a great picture. He likely had it cut and was planning on bringing it to Jerusalem, to present at the altar maybe, before heading back to Antioch. We also see Aquila and Priscilla come with him, leaving their home in Corinth. So now his team has grown. And this couple is one of the rare pictures we see in the story of Acts, or even in the New Testament, quite frankly, of a married Christian couple. I just find them fascinating. This is the first place we see them mentioned, but we're going to see more to come about them in the coming weeks. But Paul never liked to be alone. he aims to spread the gospel with the help of others, not assuming he is the Lone Ranger that can do it all on his own, which I respect. So let's continue verses 19 through 21. It says, they came to Ephesus, and he left them, which is Priscilla and Aquila, there in Ephesus. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus. We finally see Paul is able to make it to Ephesus, an area that the Lord did not really allow him to go earlier. I don't know if you all remember, but in previous passages, he wanted to go down to Asia, I think is what, and God did not allow him, right? I don't know if you guys remember that, but instead sent him over to Macedonia with the dream. But now we see, he's always seeking the Lord and allowing the Holy Spirit to lead him, and we see here that sometimes the Lord, tells Paul no. Sometimes he tells us no, but it isn't always like a no forever sometimes. Sometimes this just really means wait, and that's the case with Paul. God didn't tell him no, hard no on Asia. He just said no, but Paul can look back and say, well, it was a wait. I was going to end up there anyway. And I feel like the Lord does that with us as well. We may not know why, but we can trust the Lord who sees all the big picture, and know that he knows what's best for us. God knows the right timing. In verse 21, Paul decides to not stay long, but hopes to come back. And in the next couple of weeks, when we study Acts, we will see that he does end up coming back to Ephesus. But for now, he leaves Priscilla and Aquila there to help this infant start of a church, right? To stay with them and disciple them. Let's end with verse 22. It says, when he had landed in Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. Here we see Paul set sail and land in Caesarea, and he goes up the hill to Jerusalem and worships, and down again to Antioch, his home base. And thus this finishes Paul's second missionary journey, like in the middle of chapter 18. There's no chapter pause or nothing. It's in the middle. When I was thinking about this week's passage, one thing that the Lord kept revealing to me in it was that in the span of 3 years of Paul's, journey here on the second missionary journey, God led him. He gave him what he needed. And what did Paul need, especially when he was weary? He needed other people, God's people. And he needed God's word. We saw an example of that this week, which I think is so cool to sum it up. God offers the same thing to us. Not just when we're weary, but especially when we feel, not just when we're not weary, but especially when we do feel weary. So I just want to close with reflecting back on what God said to Paul, knowing that the principle we gain here is one we can hold on to. When we're afraid, God says to us, don't be afraid. I am with you, and you're not alone. There are others with you as well. And I think that's just a great way to end today. So let's pray. God, I just thank you for your word and how faithful you are to minister to us in it. Even in a story, God, there's principles there that you intend for us to see and learn and pick up and hold on to. And so, God, I just pray that wherever the ladies are today, at home or wherever, God, I just pray, God, that you'd meet them in a special way, whatever season they're in, Lord. If they're discouraged, God, with just being at home and not being able to get out, Lord, I pray you'd encourage them. God, I just thank you that you are with us. Lord, help us to feel your presence, God. Help us to be sensitive to your spirit, God, when we seek you, that you would speak to us and meet us where we are. In Jesus' name, amen.